Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Safira Kamila and I would like to present my paper is about hadith. So first, I would like to explain about the definition of hadith. So the definition of hadith is, according to the language, it is indicating that a short time, and hadith also means news, which is something that reported, discussed, and transferred from one person to another. And according to the Sharia term, it is things that came from Rasulullah SAW. It could be words, deeds, or confession. So hadith is a second source of Islamic teaching law after the Quran, and it is the further explanation for the first in the Quran that still global and general and absolute. Thus, the hadith occupies significant position and function in the Islamic teachings. And there are three types of hadith. First is hadith qawliyah, which is hadith that the Prophet uttered in various purpose and according to the situation. And then there are also hadith fi'liyah. It is action of the Prophet Muhammad SAW, such as the work of performing the 5 daily prayers, which are procedures and the pillars, or the work of performing the pilgrimage. And then there's also hadith takriyah. It is the action of some companion of the Prophet who had made a vow to the Prophet Muhammad SAW, whether the act was in the term of words or deeds, which that vow sometimes was keeping by silence. And then we move to the types of hadith. If we see from the source, there are two kinds of hadith. First is hadith qudsi. It is word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which was conveyed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam explained the word with his own words to the companion. And it is, in other words, the Qudsi hadith is a hadith whose meanings come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the pronunciation come from the Prophet of Muhammad. And then there is hadith nabawi. It is a pronunciation and the meaning comes from Prophet Muhammad. And then in the view of the number of the narrators, there are mutawatir hadith, which is this hadith that narrated by a number of people at every level of sanad, and it is impossible for the narrators to agree to lie. Therefore, this hadith mutawatir is believed to be true. And then there are also hadith ahad, which is this hadith that do not reach the degree of mutawatir. Then there is hadith mashhur, this hadith that narrated by 3 or more people. And then based on the sanad, there are hadith sahih, which is this hadith that has sufficient sanad from the beginning to the end. And all the sanad characters are perfect memorizers. There are two kinds of hadith sahih. First is sahih li zatihi, means that the hadith is sahih by itself without any other explanation. And then there is sahih lil ghairihi, that means that sahih reinforced by the other information. And then there is hadith hasan, is hadith that continuous sanad and narrated by the narrator who is fair, but his memorization is less perfect. There are two kinds of hadith hasan. which is Hasan li zatihi and Hasan li ghairihi. And then there is hadith da'if, which is hadith that weak, means that it doesn't meet Sahih and Hasan's requirement. And then now we move to the collector and narrators of hadith. So there are many collector or narrator of hadith who are then copied into the books, but there are several famous narrators and collector of hadith whose books are used as a reference by scholars up to these days. First is Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq. At that time, he was known as a great teacher because he was an official teacher at first university that was built during the Abbasiyah dynasty. His students were scientists and hadith experts from all over the world, and various branches of science. Among them are Abu Hanifah and Abu Malik bin Amr. And then there are also the second is Imam Bukhari. He was born in Bukhara from a rich and respected family. He collected hadith since he was a teenager and rewrote it in a famous book which is Kitab Sahih al-Bukhari. And then there are also Imam Muslim. He was born in Naisabur and has studied hadith since he was a teenager. The hadiths that he collected from various sources were rewritten in a well-known hadith book named Sahih Muslim book. And then there is Imam Abu Dawud, born in Sijistan village near Iran. He studied with various scholars from Hijaz, Sham, Egypt, and Khurasan until he finally settled in Basra. One of his famous books is the book of Sunan Abu Dawud, which focuses more on historical and social law hadith. And then there is Imam Tirmizi. He was born in the city of Tirmiz, Tajikistan. Like the other hadith scholar, he also traveled the world to study hadith, and his well-known book is Book of Sunan Tirmizi. And then there is Imam Ibn Majah, came from Qazwin, Persia or now Iran, and produced his well-known book called Sunan Ibn Majah. And the last is Imam An-Nasai, that came from Nasai, which is now Turkmenistan, and his well-known book called Sunan An-Nasai. And now we are moving to the next topic, which is history of the writing hadith. So on the period of hadith at the time of the Prophet, it's actually the hadith in this period of time is prohibited to be written, and the way Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam delivered the hadith is in several ways, such as first through the congregation at the center of his formation called Majlis al-Ilmi. Through this assembly, the friends have many opportunities to accept the hadith. And then second, the Prophet conveyed through his certain companion, which is later they conveyed to the others. And the third is the Prophet conveyed the hadith through lectures or speech in open places. And then in the hadith during the companion, especially at the period of Khulafaur Rashidin, which lasted from 11 to 40 Hijriah, since at this time the attention of the companion was still at the maintaining and disseminating the Quran. The narration of hadith was not well developed and they tend to limit it. Therefore, it is considered by the scholars to be a period that shows the limitation or narration, or called al-tasabut wal al-iqlal min al-riwayah. And then there are also hadiths at the time of writing, and not long after Rasulullah SAW passed away. The writers of hadith from among companion and tabi'in appear. Khalifah Umar bin Khattab intended to record the hadith. He gathered the other friends and they all agreed to do it, but the plans didn't implement it until it was only after Khalifah bin Abdul Aziz that instructed the Abu Bakar bin Muhammad bin Amr bin Hamz. And then in the period of hadith during the bookkeeping period, the effort to animate it and compile hadith were carried out during the 3rd Hijriah. The main step in this period began with grouping all hadith. The grouping is done by separating which hadith is marfu, mawquf, and maqtu. Hadith marfu is hadith which contain behavior of the Prophet Muhammad SAW, and maqtu is the hadith that contain of the companion, and maqtu is the hadith that contain of the behavior of tabi'in. The last is the hadith at the peak of bookkeeping period. So at this time, the 3rd Hijriah, there was effort to separate the authentic hadith from an authorized hadith, so that they were composed of 3 kinds of hadith book. First is Kitab Sahih, which is contain only Sahih hadith, and then the book of Sunan, which contain hadith Sahih and hadith Da'if, that is not evil, and then the Musnad book that contain various kind of all hadiths without any research and screening. Therefore, it was only useful for expert of hadith for comparison. The 3rd Hijriah hadith expert generally carry out tasheeh or correction or verification of the existing hadith, as well as memorizing them. Meanwhile, in the 4th Hijriah, can be said that the completion period of hadith guidance, while the 5th Hijriah onwards was the time to improve the composition of all hadith book, collect a scattered one, and make it easier to them to study. And then the period of selection or screening of hadith occurred when the government was held by the Bani Abbas dynasty, especially the time of Al-Ma'mun to Al-Muqtadir, around 201 to 300 Hijriah. Due to the tenacity and the seriousness of the scholars at this time, the hadith book emerged which only contained valid hadith. The book during its development was known as Kutub al-Sittah, or the six main books. The period of development of the latter hadith stretched out quite a long time. It's from the 1st century Hijriah to the next several centuries until the temporary period right now. So that's all the explanation that I want to say. And the last As I said, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.